Welcome back to Phil 1101 Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. So far we have discussed some arguments using theoretical rationality that purport to provide a theistic conclusion, that is, a conclusion that a GCB exists. Today I want to move into arguments that try to show that a GCB exists, but that do not use theoretical rationality, but instead use something known as practical rationality. So we mentioned before, without going much into, the distinction between practical and theoretical rationality. We've considered that using theoretical rationality might be thought to support theism, that is to say, the cosmological argument or the argument from design. You will have read in the Engaging Philosophy book the idea of the ontological argument and the various other arguments that use theoretical rationality that try to prove that a GCB exists. On the other hand, many people have felt that using theoretical rationality is not likely to succeed in proving what they want to prove by way of the existence of a GCB. And so a number of people have thought that a perhaps more effective route will be one that uses practical rationality, that is, something that tries to show not so much that belief in a GCB is justified by evidence, either a priori or a posteriori, but rather that somehow believing in a GCB is justified because it's in one's best interest to hold it. It's most prudent or practically rational to hold a belief of that kind. That's one way in which some theorists have tried to justify belief in a GCB. And it might be what people mean when they say, if you confront someone who's a theist, for example, and you have an argument with them and you find that their reasons for believing in a GCB are not entirely compelling, sometimes you'll get a response from them that goes roughly along the lines, well, you've got to have faith. But that notion that you've got to have faith is itself ambiguous. What sort of have to or gotta is in question here? Is the idea that somehow I'm under a moral obligation to have faith? And if so, why? Is it, or is there some other kind of reason that I've got to have faith? In which case, what is that reason? If I question someone's belief in the tooth fairy or Santa Claus and they say, well, you've got to have faith, the answer might not seem very satisfying because the question is, why do I have to have faith? What good is having faith in a situation that pertains to believing in Santa Claus or the tooth fairy? If the situation is different with GCB, how is it different? Today what I want to focus on is one way in which it might be different, that is concerning practical rationality. So now, this brings us to the work of the philosopher-mathematician Blaise Pascal, whose dates were 1623 to 1662. He was both a mathematician and a philosopher. He was also an inventor. He invented the first calculating machine. He invented the syringe. He thought up the basis of modern probability theory, one of the most important proponents, developers, mathematicians, thinking through the foundations of modern probability theory. Apparently some gambling friends were stuck on a conundrum as to how best to place their wagers, and they consulted their friend Blaise Pascal to see whether he, because they knew he was good at mathematics, might be able to solve their problems, and he sat down and worked out what we now think of as the basis of modern probability theory. And he's famous for what now is known as the wager, or Pascal's wager, which is a distinctive attempt to try to justify belief in a greatest conceivable being. Pascal's wager, in the short essay that's associated with today's lecture, that will be available to you on the Husky CT website, contains remarks such as the following. If there is a God, we're incapable of knowing either what he is or if he is. And Pascal's thought there is the following: that seems to be suggesting that theoretical rationality is unable to settle the question whether or not a GCB exists. So he's saying we're incapable of using theoretical rationality arguments, either a posteriori or a priori, that try to show that there is a GCB. So this is something he's suggesting is beyond the capacity of reason, at least insofar as reason uses theoretical rationality, beyond the capacity of reason to decide. But he goes on, nevertheless, in spite of all this, God is or he is not. That is, it's either one way or the other. God exists or God does not exist. Pascal goes on, but to which side shall we incline? That is to say, we living finite lives, have to make up our minds as to whether or not we believe that a GCB exists. He says reason can decide nothing here, and I think what he means by that is theoretical rationality can decide nothing here. He's going to try to argue that in a moment that another form of reason, namely practical rationality, can decide it. So when he says reason can decide nothing here, I think what he means is theoretical rationality is unable to do so. He goes on and says, a game is being played. That is to say, it's as if we're in a gambling situation. That is to say, we've got to make a choice as to whether or not a particular horse will win. In the case of the afterlife, make a choice as to whether or not, when we pass away, we'll find ourselves confronted with a GCB who is deciding what to, perhaps is deciding what to do with us in the afterlife. That's what he seems to mean when he says a game is being played, where heads or tails will turn up. Heads perhaps being a GCB exists, tails perhaps being a GCB does not exist. What will you wager? So Pascal is trying to put you in a situation of having to make a choice. He wants to make you realize that you're under pressure. You can't just put off the decision. You either need to believe or refrain from believing, and Pascal wants to argue that that could potentially have powerful implications, very far-reaching, perhaps eternal implications for what happens to you in the future. So when he says you must wager, you don't have a choice as to whether or not you make a decision that's going to have implications for your potential afterlife. So he's suggesting that theism, that is belief in a GCB, is a wager that the GCB exists, just as putting down money on a certain horse or making a bet that it will rain tomorrow, for example, with your friends. Those are wagers, and he's suggesting that theism is a wager as well. He claims in addition that both agnosticism, that is remaining neutral on the question whether or not there's a GCB, as well as atheism, in which you actually believe fully that the GCB does not exist, he claims that both agnosticism and atheism have the effect of wagering that the GCB does not exist, and therefore placing your bets on one horse, so to speak, as opposed to another. But he also points out that, well, on the other hand, notice that if you win, if you gain all. That is to say, you gain, he wants to suggest, an eternal afterlife of bliss, whereas he suggests if you lose, you lose all. That is to say, you might suffer eternal damnation, which would be pretty bad. So he's suggesting that a great deal hangs on the choice that you make, much more than what hangs on the $100 that you might place on a horse that's in tomorrow's horse race.